The Morrison government sort of committed governments in the future to this extraordinary program, which will cost vast sums of money, and no one knows what sort of what will happen at the end.
Hello and welcome to The Focus. I'm Dr. John Bruni. Today's conversation takes us to the heart of a growing strategic dilemma for Australia. US Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth recently urged the Albanese government to lift defence spending to 3.5% of GDP, a significant leap from where we are now. Prime Minister Albanese pushed back, asserting our sovereign right to determine our strategic posture, while Defence Minister Richard Marles was more nuanced, acknowledging America's concerns. To unpack the pressures, politics and practicalities that seem to divide Australia and the United States, I'm joined by defence strategist Dr. Peter Layton, a visiting fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute and former Royal Australian Air Force officer with a deep expertise in Australian and allied defence policy. Let's dive in. Peter, welcome to The Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Peter, let's start with the big picture. Is the US request for Australia to lift defence spending to 3.5% of GDP strategically reasonable, or is it an overreach that ignores our domestic constraints?
I suppose the problem is that the United States, as the global superpower, if you like, can't consider each country sort of by itself. So the figures from the Trump administration tend to be, if you like, sort of ambit claims, sort of globally. And that's part of the problem as well, is not just considering each individual country, but also that they've been varying with their sort of ideas. It's sort of gone from 3% to 3.5 to at times 5%. So it's difficult to know what they actually want in that terms. And then there's a bit of sort of overreach there about whether they can actually, if you like, sort of manage other countries to then achieve this.
Well, Australia has pledged to hit 2.4% of GDP by, I think, around 2033. From a deterrence standpoint, is this target too late given the rapidly evolving threats in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, that's a sort of a matter of timing here, isn't it? It's a very interesting one, because Secretary of Defence Hegseth at the Shangri-La conference said that he was concerned about an invasion of Taiwan that was imminent.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about times of 2027. Well, we're now midway through 2025. So almost any money that you spent now, if you were concerned about 2027, would be going into sort of short-term supplies, maintenance, weapons, etc., building up your force so that you could possibly be involved in a conflict in 2 years' time. Yeah. On the other hand, a number of European countries and the EU believes that a war with Russia is possible around 2029, equally relatively soon. Now, either of those conflicts would certainly impact Australia greatly, whether we were involved or not. We saw the pandemic and the damage done to the global supply chains. A major war in Europe or a major war over Taiwan would impact our supply lines much more significantly. So if we were actually serious about this, we're talking about spending a lot of money now in the short term, rather than as our current defence spending, which is principally aimed at building up our force for, say, 2035 or 2040. So there's a disconnect here between, if you like, when people think a war is possible and should we be preparing for it.
If Australia were to bolster its short-term prospects, what do you think the Chinese leadership would think about that? And will that make us more vulnerable to, I don't know, Chinese economic sanctions, or would it make us more vulnerable to Chinese grey zone threats? I mean, where does the Australian government, now we can talk about the Albanese government, but I'd argue we'd be under a similar situation under a Liberal Party government. Where does that leave Australia politically? Because we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. If we go with the Americans and start putting cash into the defence pot, the Chinese will get all, well, what are you doing and how dare you? We're your number one trading partner. So they're going to get all shirty with us. If we don't meet American expectations, they're going to get shirty with us. Are we in a really great position here, Peter, or what?
We are certainly trapped between the money and the arms, if you like. And there's a sort of third equation in there. If we actually decided to buy military hardware, if it was, say, advanced missiles or even spare parts for our jets and our warships,
Yeah.
if we spent money today, or if we entered contract today, we probably wouldn't get that stuff until, say, 3 or 4 years' time. So you wouldn't actually be spending stuff, if you like, until the end of this decade, regardless. Because the Australian government usually only spends money when it gets something. It won't spend money in advance, say 4 or 5 years. It doesn't like signing a contract and hoping for the best, if you like.
Yeah.
So even if we spent a lot of money today, we would have trouble ramping up our military side. That leaves us, of course, on the other side of the house. If there is going to be a war, say 2027 or 2029, then maybe we should build up the rest of Australia to be resilient. And in particular, of course, obviously, fuel stocks are a classic example here. The government website says that Australia at the moment has 30 to 35 days of fuel stocks, most days, if you like. So we could make Australia a lot more resilient, and that's possibly a good thing for a whole pile of circumstances. Because if the risk of war is rising, even if we're not involved, as I said, we would be impacted. So making us a little harder on the civilian side would obviously have military benefits, and then might perhaps address your issue there about concerning the Chinese, because the Chinese would be concerned that we're having a sudden military build-up as well, and they would start thinking, what do the Australians know we don't know? And
Right.
they might become, as you say, a bit more aggressive, although they've been fairly aggressive so far. And so that might start a spiral towards war as well.
You use the term signaling, and I'm just wondering, I'm putting my autocrat's cap on at the moment. Now, in any good autocracy, as you know, money is really no object in terms of pump priming your military forces, because, of course, the numbers that they put out in the public domain are usually quite inaccurate. Much of the funding is hidden, and there's a pea and shell game with intelligence agencies to figure out exactly what's being spent on what sort of capability. Is the disadvantage for Australia in the weird situation caught between China and the United States the fact that we're like the little honest brokers? We're so honest. We've got to be transparent about everything. Oh, yes, Uncle Sam, this is exactly what we're going to be doing. Oh, and Uncle G, don't worry about it, mate. We're okay with you. You can keep trading with us. We're a sure bet. I mean, is the fact that Australia needs to be a little bit more bloody minded in terms of what we declare publicly about our defence forces, which will then give the government of the day more flexibility in either ramping up or not ramping up, depending on what the strategic circumstances happen to be. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's sort of two ways about playing that, I suppose. One is that what you include in your defence budget, that is termed your defence budget, varies from nation to nation. So we could put a whole pile of civilian resilience measures into the defence budget on a nominal accounting sense, and appear to be spending 3.5% overnight, if you like.
Yeah.
And that might please President Trump. So that might be a good way of sort of addressing that particular problem. On the other hand, as you know, there's an awful lot of Australians who are concerned that there's not much transparency about our current defence budget and what is being spent. Now, I say that's not completely tongue-in-cheek. So Marcus Hellier, the doyen, if you like, of Australian defence budget experts, has been doing it for an awfully long time now. He pointed out last defence budget, there seemed to be a lot of money being shifted from major capital equipment acquisitions into the sustainment budget.
Yep.
Now, that could be because the equipment that we have is becoming more expensive to operate. I mean, the F-35, for example, it's a very expensive platform. On the other hand, it could also mean that money is being put into the sustainment budget globally. And at the last National Defence Strategy, it certainly forecast putting more money into sustainment, in particular building up the Australian Defence Force's stock of spares and maintenance items and weapons so that Australia could in fact fight a war, if you like, because you need to sort of have all that logistic support squared away. And they spoke about building warehouses and filling warehouses full of stuff. It's not clear where that sustainment money's gone. So while we're making an assumption it's all going into that operating costs have suddenly risen, someone on the outside might go, well, I wonder if that's really true.
Mm,
So there's a bit of sort of opaqueness there. So now the Department of Defence may not be opaque to say confuse some external power. It's probably being opaque just to confuse the Australian Parliament and the Australian public.
Well, there's also, to put tongue firmly in cheek, normally when we see things, of a bureaucratic nature in the West, but also in Australia, because we're all part of the same family, it's not about some sort of deep conspiracy. It's usually bureaucratic inefficiency and ineffectiveness that sort of overtakes the system. So, we could make the case that the Australian Department of Defence is sort of shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic to keep the Australian public kind of like mushrooms in the little shed. But I would argue that perhaps it's not quite as conspiratorial, and maybe there's a little bit of inefficiency and ineffectiveness embedded within the system that gives the appearance of some grand conspiracy, but really there isn't anything to be seen here. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think there's a grand conspiracy as far as the public goes. However, all defence departments around the world are not overly attracted to government oversight or to public questions. So they do tend to try and obfuscate, if you will, so that people don't know exactly what is happening. Now, that's often dressed up as a national security issue, and therefore, this is all classified, and we can't tell you, Minister, or we can't tell you, public. But as I said, everyone likes in all bureaucratic organisations, everyone likes to keep something up their sleeve, if you like. So I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy, but I would say it's probably fairly normal bureaucratic behaviour, as the famous BBC program Yes Minister used to show every week.
Yes, that was a delicious show. It really was. Okay, so Peter, is it possible? Is it just conceivable that Albanese's pushback against Hegseth's Shangri-La dialogue imposition could be considered like Australia taking a free rider role here? When you think of America's commitments into the Middle East, into Europe, and elsewhere in the world, the Indo-Pacific in particular, if we have a prime minister that isn't so enthusiastic about spending the coin to please the Americans, when will it be that the great orange one of the White House turns around and says, you know what? You're a free rider. You're a free rider. I mean, at what point do we actually get shellacked by that sort of reputation?
Well, there's a few things there, I suppose. The American 3.5% is an impressive amount, or however much it is, and that's because it's a global superpower, as you says, that puts things into Europe and into the Middle East and into Africa and Central America, and a whole pile of other places. Australia is not a global superpower and doesn't have quite the same ambitions, if you like, or the same needs. It's not immediately obvious why the percentage of the GDP that the US has is necessarily applicable to, say, Australia or to Luxembourg.
Mm.
You can see it from a European point of view. You've got Russia there, and you've got Russia threatening at the same time as the US is talking about moving its focus away from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. At the same time as US president seems conflicted between whether he supports Ukraine or Russia. So there's a lot of uncertainties there, and certainly if I was sitting in Europe as the Europeans are, and I would be making noises like we need to do something because Russia, a major war by 2029, does look a plausible sort of idea. But for us here, I mean, it's interesting. President Trump certainly gives the Prime Minister a bit of top cover here. If the Prime Minister wants to be ambitious and say, well, we might raise it to 3% over the next 10 years, rather than, as you said, I think it's 2.33% by 2033. Nicely all sort of organised there, isn't it, as far as numbers go?
Yes.
Bearing in mind that, of course, only things like that are aspirational only. The current government cannot commit future governments. They will do whatever they wish to do. But because Australian parliaments Australian parties, major parties, stay in power roughly 2 or 3 years, generally speaking, sort of 2 or 3 terms, generally speaking, about 3 terms, you'd expect the defence budget, you'd expect in the fiscal year 23, well, let me get this right, 2033, 2034, in that fiscal year, that there'll be an LNP government. So it would be up to them to meet it. So it's a bit like AUKUS. You are sort of tying somebody's hands up, or trying to, by sort of political deadweight.
Yeah.
So I mean, so the current government could make promises and just see how the future works out. And President Trump may leave power in, say, 3.5 years' time. We don't know, but we assume that. And so everything then may change. I've always been a believer, though, that in defence, it's not the inputs, the spending that count, it's the outcomes, because it's the people and the equipment on the front line that actually fights the wars. Now, while the sinews of war, the famous quote, is finance, there's no doubt about that. It's what you get for your money that counts. And so I'd be rather focusing upon, sort of be results orientated rather than inputs focused.
All right. On that, though, I mean, let's play a hypothetical here. Let's do a bit of red teaming. So it's the year 2027, and the red balloon goes up. China is attempting some sort of military action, either in the South China Sea or in Taiwan. What at that time do you think that the Australian government could deploy in support of American forces fighting the good fight? I mean, apart from a handful of SAS, a couple of aircraft from the RAAF, and maybe a warship or two, and if we're lucky, one submarine. I mean, what is the overall weight that we bring to the table as a staunch American ally in the 21st century? I would argue not a hell of a lot.
Well, the Americans would argue something differently, I suppose. And I think you can see that if you've been following the last 5 or 7 years, watching exercises out of Guam. And the Americans have been involving our E-7 early warning aircraft, and they would like to buy some, but they're having a bit of trouble about finding the finances for that. So we've got those because their early warning aircraft are now 40 years old or so, and they're unreliable. So our aircraft do get invited along to pretty much every exercise in the region. The second aircraft that gets invited is usually the F-18, the EF version, the Growlers, which are defence suppression against surface-to-air missile systems. And the third aircraft is the F-18 Super Hornets, because they've got long-range anti-ship missiles. And I have to say that the Growlers have a very suitable missile fit against ships as well. And the F-35s will, over time, be modified to be able to carry the Naval Strike Missile that Australia's building a factory just outside Newcastle to build. I'm not sure whether that software will be available in the F-35 by, say, 2027, but I would suggest that we probably put our AWACS aeroplanes up there, probably a fleet of as many F-18s, probably as many F-18s, both the Growler and the Super Hornet version, that we could up there, which is probably, 20, 25 aeroplanes, sort of something like that, and some of our tanker aircraft to support all that. And that would be a pretty potent anti-ship package. Now, clearly, that would be insufficient in some hypothetical great war against China that has 300 warships, sort of things, because we haven't, the current government has been buying anti-ship missiles like it is going out of style. Whether all those missiles will be here by 2027 is debatable, but nonetheless, that's sort of quite a package. And in addition, of course, there would be 1 or 2 of the Hobart class destroyers, which would probably have Tomahawk anti-ship missiles on them with their 600 or 700 mile range, maybe a submarine or 2. So I think if we did decide to deploy forces forward, it would be air heavy during this decade anyway. Because as you say, the Anzac class frigates are pretty old now. You're probably not sort of likely to send those forward. Army's talking about getting ground launched anti-ship missiles, probably unlikely to be available during this decade. So it's really sort of it's sort of air heavy plus the Hobart class, sort of 1 or 2 ships tossed on. Now, bear in mind, the Americans might not want that from us at all, because maybe compared against their outfit, that's not that much, And so they may be perfectly happy to just, if you like, use Australia as the unsinkable aircraft carrier, and they've been putting a lot of infrastructure into Darwin and Tyndall places. They're paying paying for that. So maybe our contribution might be simply as a suitable piece of real estate.
Yeah, I think that that's probably where I see it as well. When we talk about these things, there's the political angle and then there's the military angle. And obviously, when we talk about the military angle, our military to military ties with the United States are impeccable. We have great relationships with the Americans, no problems whatsoever. However, at the political level, it's a different ballgame entirely. And what I'd like to get a sense from you is, do you think that whatever we do under the Trump administration, and in 2027, Trump is still going to be president, if the balloon did go up, would Trump look at Australia's contribution as it's just too small? Some people say it's the smallest contribution, or will he say that he's really happy with what the Australians are contributing? Because really the numbers, irrespective of what we put into the field, I mean, and you rightly unpacked it all, but they're going to be quantitatively small in comparison to what will be going on because it will be a high intensity war. I mean, once you put airplanes, with missiles and warships of missiles, it's going to be on for young and old. And these weapons aren't necessarily going to come out of the other side of the first engagement. So again, you've got a small packet of forces that if they're unlucky in the opening of any war, you're going to have at least a good third of it torn out from under you. And then what are you going to replace it with? So there is that sort of mass capacity as well, which I think Australia will need to look at some point, right?
So there's a number of issues in there, I suppose. The attrition during a major war, normally speaking, is, as you say, horrendous. So, sort of that package that I spoke about there, I'd sort of think after a month or so, you'd be down to about half of it left.
Yeah.
And you may have lost a Hobart class destroyer with 200 people or so on board as well.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, everything that's lost during a war like that is irreplaceable. An example was World War II, where the Australian Navy started World War II with a number of large warships that had been built in the UK in the interwar period. They left at the end of the war. They had none left. They'd all been sunk or damaged. So that would be, in this case, with the Hornet fleet or the Hobarts and things like that. All of our expensive platform, anything that was lost could not be replaced. Yeah. So it would be a short-term pulse of power, after which we would retire, and fight them with the bayonets on the beaches, if you like, sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It would be very much like Ukraine. Ukraine had a short, sharp start of the war too, and that was pretty horrific for the Air Force and the very small Navy bit that they had left. Yeah. And they resorted to drones and a whole pile of drones and missiles and a whole pile of other things as well. And we could do it too, but that's a different conversation perhaps. But to go right back to your first thing there, well, so if the Chinese decided to have a major against Taiwan, and there are many reasons why that would be, the Chinese may think that's not a good idea. From an economic point of view, that would seem very foolish. There's a whole pile of reasons, which Russia has nicely demonstrated that it's not. Their war against Ukraine appeared like a walkover, but it's economically hurting them, it's militarily hurting them. Whole pile of reasons why that was a bad idea. And China might see that and go, nah, I don't like that. But President Trump may not necessarily support Taiwan either, where we are unsure about this. And the level of support would be unsure too. I mean, one of the heavy hitters at the Pentagon these days is saying that, well, Taiwan's not an existential issue, for the United States. It's important, but is it that important really? Is it worth, if you like, a possible nuclear exchange?
Yeah.
So we're unsure what President Trump would do, and you've heard the acronym attached to President Trump these days, TACO, as the Americans say. Trump always chickens out. I see this analysis done by Shapiro or something just in the last little while, where he's looked at the last Trump presidency and found in 25 cases Trump's backed out of 22 of them.
Correct.
So the odds are, if the same sort of laws are probably applied, then the odds are that Trump might not stand up for Taiwan. But let's assume that he does, and then the American military we are assuming, will want to use Australia, and they'll want the politicians on side. And the Australian politicians are going to be a bit reticent here because, as you correctly say, if we support the Americans, our economy is going to be in bad shape after the war. It's not
Yes, it
going to
will.
be good. And what's more, if we support the Americans, that impacts all of our neighbours in Southeast Asia as well. And Indonesia in particular would like to stay neutral in all this. And they wouldn't be overly happy about us being involved either, and we'd probably need to keep to ourselves. So you would have an enormous tail in Australian foreign affairs. This would be a diplomatic issue for years, and all this is assuming, of course, that the Americans win at the end of it, or that the Allies win sort of at the end of it. So I think President Trump convincing the Australian government to come in, it might be a fairly measured. Our involvement with the Americans might be more measured than you might think. It might not be the end of the world from day one, until people got a better understanding whether the American commitment was rock solid and that they would actually stay the course. That's another issue in itself. I mean, we look at World War I and World War II as an example. That the Americans came in late after all the other people had taken some pretty big hits.
Yes, they did.
There's a whole lot of factors and historical analogies here that might encourage Australian governments to be quite cautious about being bullish.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of that, I'll raise another issue which has more domestic import. Now, those on the left would always say that if we end up ramping up our defense expenditure, we might spark a regional arms race, or we're in danger of militarizing our society. So if that's the case, and we went ahead and did whatever we had to do, and say it came that Albanese thought that, oh my God, Hegseth is right, the threat is imminent, we're going to have to start really doing something quite spectacular. How do you think Australian society will view such a move, a rapid move to a war footing? Do you think that the Australians would be behind the government of the day, or will there be those traditional splits between the extreme left on the one side, the extreme right on the other, the right being more pro-military and more gung-ho, the left being, no, let's give peace a chance and all that kind of stuff? How do you see this play out from a social perspective in Australia, were it to come to that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on the government. I mean, the government got Australia involved in the Middle East over the objections of the public, if you like.
Yeah.
We'll remember that one.
Oh yeah.
But if we look back slightly further to say Timor, the public got the government involved when it didn't want to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
So if the media start showing pictures of just like we see from Gaza tonight, and they'll be pretty bad pictures of, say, of say bombers bombing sort of Taipei and women and children and sort of all this stuff and machine gunning students and things. The vision could be sort of World War II graphic or Vietnam-like graphic, in which case the Australian public historically would sort of get a head of steam and demand the government do something. And that's when you perhaps get the government saying, well, it's a long way away, it's very, very difficult. We'll make a contribution, we'll be involved in the defence of Guam or something to help the Americans out that way. Something which is really quite measured. And the Americans can do the offensive stuff and we'll just do the defensive stuff. Because the government at least will be trying to think about the post-war era and what happens later. The public will see what will be a series of horrific images of an Asian democracy dying, or sort of real time in colour on the big screen, and it would not be pretty. And so I think you'd find the democracies around the world there would be a big call for action as well, just like there was with Ukraine. Now people will say that we don't get excited about the Sudan and things like that, and that's a valid call. But Taiwan is different in that we've been talking about this now for 20 years, for sort of longer than that, really, since 1947. And everyone understands that their computer comes from Taiwan, so it will have a personal impact on them. And they also understand that Taiwan is a normal, developed country full of normal, developed people, if you like. They'll feel that it could be them. So we should make a stand. Remember, that it'll be Munich or various things. So I think I would expect the public, if you like, to be leading the government, and the government maybe to be sort of trying to be restraining their enthusiasm.
Okay, so in a recent Lowy Institute article, The Case Against Ramping Australia's Defence Spending, it argues that increasing defence expenditure could strain the Australian economy and divert funds from critical sectors like health and education. Given this perspective, how can Australia balance the need for enhanced defence capabilities with the imperative to maintain robust social services, especially in a time when, as we've just been discussing, things look very fungible in terms of timescale. I mean, it may happen far sooner than we would expect, and so therefore the government of the day will have to make decisions as to how the public monies are being expended in a way that hopefully benefits the Australian people. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just be flippant slightly first. So when someone says that we should increase the defence budget, I say, good idea, let's increase taxes. And as was shown at the last election, other people don't think increasing taxes is a good idea, especially the people in the higher income groups who, because of the progressive tax system, feel that they'd be paying more taxes themselves. At which time most of them say, oh, we should cut the NDIS. So a Labor government would find it difficult to, if you like, impose the cost of a defence build-up upon the disabled people rather than the well-off able people. It would be a hard sell. That's being a bit flippant, but it sort of shows some of that sort of tensions in there. I was quite struck by the new British Strategic Defence Review that was issued last night our time, and they make a point in there, quite a it is one of their major 3 or 4 point sort of thing, that defence spending should be spent in a way that helps Britain economically overall. It's not just, if you like, just for defence purposes, but for Britain as a whole. And they expand upon this argument in the education sense that you have to bear in mind that the service is used to educate an awful lot of tradespeople, for instance. But as the services are now out of that business, and that's done by the states, the Department of Defence outsourced all that, if you like, and they did a hospital pass on to the states. And when we talk about the trades, of course, we're now talking about all the computer stuff as well, and the university degrees and cyber warfare, and a million other different things that a modern defence force needs, with that uses highly sophisticated technology. So I think you could perhaps, to a certain extent, have an expansion of education in the broad sense, both from that sort of from the trade skilling stuff right up to sort of serious university courses here about educating Australians better, as an example of how defence money can be spent if there was a sort of an increase to get some return for the wider Australia. And the second thing that they spoke about was, so defence has money which is used for innovation. And innovation is a terribly fashionable word in defence circles now. And the British government is saying, well, we can use this money to be innovative and apply it to particular dual-use technologies so that we grow, invigorate those dual-use industries in Britain that will have both a commercial benefit and a defence benefit. So if you like, they're being very strategic about how they use their cash and getting the most sort of use out of it. Now, what I mean by sort of dual use is, for instance, and you could say for an example that's going on right now here in Brisbane is quantum computing. You will recall that the federal government and the Queensland government had put, I think, $500 million each into building a facility here in Brisbane. Now, quantum computing has huge military spin-offs as well. So this is a dual use that is both computing will be useful for things like, say, for weather estimations and climate change predictions as well. But quantum is extremely big as far as crypto goes, and military forces require high-grade crypto, and sort of all this fits sort of neatly. So I think you could to a certain extent sell an increase in the defence budget if it's not just going into, if you like, just into sort of buying spare parts for the Aegis radar system for the Hobart class. If it's going into educating Australians and into Australian firms, which are dual-use firms, you'd have to sort of think about that strategic use of it quite a bit. But I see the British point. I suppose a third thing that I mentioned was, of course, they're looking at other sources of funding, not just government funding. They're talking about using venture capitalists as well. And they're setting up a process there with an advisory board of venture capitalists and the MOD getting and the venture capitalists getting much closer together, so the venture capitalists can appreciate what to invest in. And as I just said about the British use of their money to be strategic about what British industries they invest in, you can see that there would be a nice little sort of tight network there at some British club somewhere, where the MOD tells a venture capitalist this company down the road is where they would like the money, and the government, Treasury and Finance would have previously agreed that this was a good firm to invest in.
One could make the argument that the Australian government is doing just that with AUKUS, right? I mean, we're expanding our educational capacities, especially in STEM here in South Australia, where hopefully we'll get a boat built at some point. And so one would say that the reason why it's so popular here in South Australia isn't so much that we're building submarines. That seems to be secondary to the fact that we're expanding our STEM base here in South Australia. It's also something of a jobs boon at some point when we start getting the first boats in. There'll be a lot of hands-on to try to create this new first of type vessel. So, in a sense, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to make the general public stakeholders in the defense of the country, just as the British seem to be doing through their new strategic review. But of course, we all know that it's great to have these papers and it's great to have government spruiking them publicly in the media. But in the end, they're very complex kind of designs. And many times, what is in theory a great idea doesn't work out so well in a practical sense. So if you're taking a project like, modernizing and redeveloping the British Armed Forces, you're going to carry some ideas forward, but the whole box and dice of ideas that you initially had in your strategic review, some of that stuff ain't going to translate into reality. Similarly with AUKUS, so we've got these ambitions, but how much of those ambitions will actually come to fruition? And that will really determine how the Australian people feel about their defence forces or their local defence industries. Is it a value add? Do I still feel invested in this, or is this just a waste of time for some rich people who like to play with weapons?
Yeah, I know that's right. And
Mm.
I mean, AUKUS. I'm interested to hear whether you've actually noticed any difference from AUKUS there in South Australia. I say that because the first submarine's not planned to be built, I suppose, there until the late, sort of till the second half of the 2030s. It's still
Mm.
starting at a sort of a decade ago. I'm
Mm.
not sure how the education's going, or if it's sort of going at all. Um, and
It's going, yeah. Go
it's
on.
going okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And the British Defence White Paper was sort of keen about touting British jobs building Australian submarines in Scotland. They weren't talking about Australia building submarines. They were keen about Britain building them.
Yeah.
So AUKUS again, sort of the Morrison government sort of committed governments in the future to this extraordinary program, which will cost a vast sums of money, and no one knows what sort of what will happen at the end. I
No,
think the
indeed.
British one's slightly different. I think that where the Brits going now is slightly different in that, of course, we are talking about smaller systems, drones and autonomous vehicles and all this sort of stuff, which really are quite sort of almost hobbyist stuff and sort of smaller stuff. So I would certainly hope that could happen faster. And there are a number of companies around Australia already doing this, and they've built and proven many of the systems, at least proven them up to to be sort of to a reasonable level of technology readiness. So if we spent that money in Australia, it would be more, if you like, commercialising what is out there now and making it able to be manufactured in sort of building sort of stuff like that.
Well, I think that, just getting back to, AUKUS and what it means to South Australia, I think that there's a lot of hope still embedded within the program. I don't know how much of it's going to come true because, of course, there's still the great uncertainty as to whether or not we get a functional submarine out of the Americans. The American shipyards are desperately trying to boost their own domestic capabilities to produce submarines for the US Navy. Whether they have extra capacity in spite of the Australian investment in submarines in the United States, whether or not that actually means that we are guaranteed boats, that's a different kettle of fish. And as you say, it's a long lead time project. One of the things that I think that we are obviously noticing from a personnel perspective in defense industry is the skill shortage. We just don't have enough people. And of course, when people do make their applications from certain countries, they don't meet the security requirements. So, of course, if they come from they could be highly skilled people from India, for instance. Many of them will not meet Australian security standards to come in, so they're automatically disqualified from joining the potential AUKUS workforce. I mean, I know that we have to guard our secrets and stuff, but at the same time, if we're doing a moonshot style program, you need to make sure that you've got enough personnel, necessary skilled personnel, to help kickstart this thing. We've already come from way behind the eight ball on that score. But anyway, that's a story for another time as well. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to the Focus Podcast. If you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're on Spotify or Apple, leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us reach more listeners interested in global affairs, defense, and geopolitics. You can also find us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. Just search for John Bruni, the Focus Podcast, or Sage International, and join the conversation. Now, let's get back to our discussion with Peter Layton. Peter, what's the operational reality of absorbing a potential increase in defense expenditure? I mean, could defense actually spend that kind of money wisely without waste or distortion?
I mean, depends what your definition of waste is, but it would certainly take quite a long time to actually reach the contract stage, if you like. You'd be sort of talking 3 or 4 years at least. So why does it take so long to reach a contract stage? Let's say, well, if you're going to if the start of the process is, say, a tender document, you're putting out a request for a tender, bear in mind that since the 1990s, the trend in defence has been to take military people away from the major capital equipment projects and put civilians in there as a public servants or as consultants or contractors, etc. So the people who are writing the tender documents don't necessarily know anything about what they want. They're buying it on behalf of the military people. So there's a lot of toing and froing goes on where the military people try and explain everything using, and of course military speak is famous as being impenetrable. They try and convert the military speak into sort of common language, if you like. Having got a tender, then that takes about 2 years or so. It's actually a really complicated process because you're talking about, because everything, when you look at say a warship or an aeroplane or a tank, it's vastly complicated. And then you've got to look at the support system, logistics, supplies. How long will you keep this thing running for? What's its life? What's its structural fatigue? There's a million different issues. So it takes a long time to actually get the tender documents right. Put that out in the street, give the company 6 months to say respond, 3 months, 6 months, comes back with all these different costs, etc. Government then takes about 6 months to say 9 months to say, oh, that's okay, and funds it. And then if you've chosen a company, the government has the funding, you're right to go. It'll then take you another year or so to actually sign a contract, because all the companies will then say, well, now you're committed. Let me tell you the real story. I might not be able to build this overnight. I might actually take 3 years. Is that okay? So before companies will sign a contract, they want to make dead sure that they can do what they've said and that they understand what defence has in fact told them, because sometimes they may be misunderstanding, especially most companies are obviously foreign companies. There can be a language issue here, a language issue even between English speakers about what. So you're talking sort of 4 or 5 years before you even get to a contract. So say if you turn up with a large sum of money and you wanted to put it into major platforms like that, it's a long time before you actually get something out the other end. And once the contract's signed, then the company will start building something, and it's probably 4 or 5 years after that. So you're talking into the middle of the next decade before sort of very much happens. So you could, as you just said before, I suppose, say that you'll increase the defence budget out at 2035, because that's probably when you'd actually need it to start paying for stuff that was actually turning up. As I said, the government only pays for stuff which is sort of it actually gets. Mm-hmm. So there is waste in there in the sense that there's a waste of time that goes on. It just takes a sort of long time. And the counter argument to that, of course, is, well, I know what I want. I want an F-35. Let me go and I'll just buy a bunch of those. She'll be right on the night. Well, the trouble is that F-35s are sort of made. There are none waiting on the shelf for you to buy one. They're only built after you've signed a contract and paid a bunch of money for it. Put a deposit down, usually quite a sizable one. So getting through that stage will sort of take a little while through the American system, which obviously the American government has to approve the sale of it to someone that wants to buy, and F-35. And then it's between 3 to 5 years after that to actually build it. And the bills at the moment, F-35 is having some build standard issues. The sort of the old one that wasn't in the production line last year is not as good as the one coming at the end of this year. Do you want the old one, but we could get that to you quicker, but the new one will be really cool. You surely want that, but it'll be delayed. So even if you didn't bother about everything and just said, I just want one, get it for me, it can still take you a long time. And I would, caution that when you just buy things off the drop of a hat like that, you can get yourself into some trouble. I was in the previous century, I was involved in buying laser guidance bomb kits, and some money became available from the Howard government initiative, and it was just before Christmas, and everybody else was on leave, so I, in my position, approved some stuff that was just fairly leading forward. Anyway, that was all good, and the new stuff was coming, and it was all great, and what everyone wanted, and everybody was happy. And then just before it arrived, the company rang me up and they said, "Hey, listen, we weren't exactly sure what you wanted because you just said get me some stuff quick." So we did. Did you want this for the F-18 or for the F-111? Because there's different little bits required. And I said, I should have specified that. He said, so just to be on the safe side, we put both in. Okay. Oh. And I said,
off the hook there, Peter.
thank goodness for that. And it was some minor. It was like I think it was an umbilical cord. It was something that was not, so you could race out and buy one off the shelf, so it was hardly a biggie. But it was a great example of, if you don't actually specify exactly what you want, you can't expect the company on the other side of the world to know what you want. Now, I've been dealing with them for years before, so that was fine. But especially if you're ordering a warship or a plane, and you just say, I'll have one off the shelf, thanks, it might not be what you think. There might be something important left out that you can't refuel it with your refueling equipment. You might buy a large airplane that doesn't fit on your taxiways, or the weight of the airplane may damage the airfields. There's a lot of issues go on here that I'd always caution about. Racing out and buying something, just like racing out and buying a brand new car tomorrow, you can get bitten.
Well, indeed you can. And I mean, look, honestly, Peter, we've got to try to keep the time. I could speak to you about this all day, and I hope that you can come back and we can unpack defence acquisition in Australia, because that's a hoary old chestnut that needs to be pulled apart at some point. But look, with regard to where we are currently, if we were to get some sort of increase in the defence budget, when we're talking about capability, in your experience, where should that money go? Should it go to submarines? Should it go to missile defense, basing infrastructure, cyber, drones, personnel? Where should it go? What should be the key priority of any government, including the one that we currently have, if all of a sudden, by magic, a bunch of money were to appear? What would be the priority?
I mean, Australia and the Defence Department is always short of people. So I'd certainly like to recruit and retain more people. Defence is trying to do that, and the current minister says that they've turned the corner, but we have to wait and see whether that's sort of a complete turnaround, if you like, and that success is repeated next year. My current enthusiasm, I suppose, is for what's happened in the Ukraine was that they were able to introduce these autonomous systems, these robots. It wasn't quickly. It took about 2 years or so to get into service. But now they're in mass production. They're producing, literally millions of those first-person view drones each year, let's say. But there's many different kinds of drones, many different kinds of robots. It's that smaller, the many, and the affordable, which is attracting me, if you like. Yep. Now, that kind of Ukrainian front line, where you have artificial intelligence and surveillance systems, which are giving you, if you like, a great picture of the front line, which is then being passed to various drones, robot systems, artillery systems, and it's a very high attrition front line. That front line favours the defence. It is certainly stopping the Russian offensive dead in its tracks, and the Russians are suffering just extraordinary losses. They are advancing, but they're advancing because they are willing to take extraordinary personnel losses. That success, of course, has inspired the Americans to now to double down on Taiwan with the so-called hellscape, where they see having, if you like, the Ukrainian front line replicated on the shores of Taiwan and defending Taiwan against some mythical Chinese amphibious attack for at least a month or so until the Americans can circle the wagons and get the Allies organised and come to Taiwan's rescue. It's also now influencing the Baltic nations and Poland with the famous drone wall that they're talking about there. And these kinds of technologies have been proven in the Ukraine war. Australia has even sort of sent stuff as well to it. So I would invest in that. And that includes the loyal wingman, the Ghost Bat they're building up just outside of Brisbane here, the Andrel, that little submarine, the Ghost Shark they're talking about building in Sydney. There's a range of Australian products, Spear Tooth, Cerberus, Atlas. There's a whole range of air, land and sea and undersea systems that I think you could turn into mass producible items and at least get your production line going, so that if there was a war in 2027, you could react very quickly. Because just as I said, bear in mind the platforms we have now, if it's a high attrition war, they're going to go very quickly. And after the first month, we'll have to start thinking about what we do then, because those things can't be replaced for 5-7 years. And so the Ukrainian solution of the small, the many, and the affordable, the robots and the autonomous systems, this looks both militarily attractive and also attractive from a point of view of being able to be introduced relatively quickly.
Okay, so Peter, we recently spoke with the docent of the Finnish National Defence University, Brigadier General Jiri Ratasalo, on Finland's total defence concept and what Australia could learn from this comprehensive defence arrangement. Could lifting the Australian defence budget allow Australia to consider some limited form of national service, perhaps confined only to the reserves? Would such a move be welcomed by the Australian public, or even, dare I say, the OD itself?
Yeah, I mean, once you start talking about, well, the reserves or lifting the number of people, it wouldn't be, sort of a voluntary basis. You sort of talk about a conscription basis, and certainly Finland certainly uses that, and they have a selective form of conscription because they clearly can't take everybody in. I mean, let's say we had conscription for everybody in Australia at, say, the age of 20. We're talking just under 300,000 people. Well, if all those people turned up at the recruiting depots Tuesday, the Department of Defence just couldn't handle the sort of numbers like that. So you'd have to be very selective. And then you've got, of course, before you can do that, you then have to expand the training organisation quite a lot, depending on how many people you are taking in. Now, the Finns have been doing this since since before World War II. So they've gradually over time built up a reserve standby army of all these ex-conscripts. So they can feel something like an army of 280,000 people. From a nation of 5 or 7 million people or something. It's an extraordinary number, but it's taken a long time. Every sort of year they might train 30,000. Next year they'll train another 30, so they've got 60,000. Then next year, and so it goes on. So Australia could start doing that again because we've done things like that before, but it would take a while to get to those large force sizes. Which brings you on to the course of things of, we did have systems like that in place, say, before World War I and World War II, and it was introduced, if you like, in the 1939 to 1941 period when we were just fighting a war in Europe. But the militia training involved was only about 6 or 7 weeks long. So we sort of get ourselves excited, I suppose, with should the conscription be, say, 1 year or 2 years? But maybe there's alternatives here where it might only be, say, 6 months or sort of something better. I was impressed that the Army is talking about with their reserve concept now is that they'll take people in and they'll get a similar training to what the Army has given the Ukrainians in the UK. So if you like, sort of 2 months of intensive training to get them up to that kind of a standard. So that sort of sounds attractive. But it would still be, you need an expansion of the training base, which means taking, if you like, regulars from the front line to be your instructors. And it also means that when these people come in, you need to have barracks for them. You need to have them fed. You need to pay them a wage. You may actually have to pay them some compensation because you're taking, university students. You're taking people away from their life, if you like. There's a whole lot of little extras that sort of go on here. So it wouldn't be cheap, and you've got to decide what should they be trained in. Should they be trained in infantry tactics, or maybe how to fly drones, or maybe go to sea and fire missiles from warships? So you have to have a big think what you want these people to do. But there's no doubt that in a war, that Australia would once again be short of people.
Okay, finally, Peter, in a Trump 47 world where unpredictability and transactional alliances define US foreign policy, should we really be reshaping our defense policy based on American demands?
It's an interesting question, and I think it sort of highlights what the government what our new government, our Labor government, the sector, should be doing this year, this calendar year, and early into next year. The Trump factor is out there. It is definitely volatile. We are unsure what will happen on a day-by-day basis. Our defence posture and our defence force structure is built around ironclad guarantees from the Americans, as far as we understand it. We think that they're ironclad, and upon a highly reliable America. All that baseline assumptions no longer apply. What does this mean? And I think this government needs to start working about actually turning, sort of, if you like, barroom discussion into strategic guidance and into force structure. I think we need to start being fairly sort of hard-nosed about this, because maybe following Trump is the right thing to do. We need to make a conscious decision rather than just, if you like, sort of bumble along. If we bumble along following someone with such a volatile policies, we could be very badly surprised. And defence is a serious business. You are betting the future of the nation on this. It's all of our futures and all of our kids' futures. So I think the current government needs to start thinking about the Trump era. Now, of course, they don't want to think about that at all because it's a politically very, very difficult. The American alliance is set in stone, or we think it is, and talking about it is not something that the minister wants to do, especially a Labor government doesn't want to do, because they'll always be accused of being soft on defence. But regardless of their sort of personal sort of views in this, they need to get on and start thinking very seriously. And this will be a whole of government discussion, because this is really a sort of big time business. What to do about Trump?
Okay, Peter, thank you for sharing your insights and being on the Focus.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Whatever passes for Australian strategic thinking is not strategic. We have no national strategic culture to speak of. The modern ADF is critically understaffed and too dependent on overseas supply chains to provide for its own defence in a real fight. And this problem should be a concern to the Australian government, the Australian people, and the great and powerful friend of ours, the United States. But there you go. From Brisbane in the Australian state of Queensland, we were speaking with Dr. Peter Layton. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Peter Layton. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Peter and connect with him on social media. Now on to questions for the audience. Should Australia agree to lift defence spending to 3.5% of GDP if the US is asking, or is it time to draw a red line on sovereignty? Where would you prioritise increased defence spending? On personnel, submarines, missile systems, drones, cyber or infrastructure? Is Australia overly reliant on the United States for its security, or are current defence spending levels sufficient given our regional threat environment? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have any comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on thefocuspodadl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.